It is so nice when you have a country house, no matter whether it is a luxurious residential house or a bungalow that has recently turned into a warehouse of garden equipment, with a table and an old sofa that were kicked out of the apartment because one day they may come in handy. In fact, I was the happy owner of such a small bungalow, which was built by my grandparents a few decades ago. I begged my parents for almost a whole month so that they would finally allow me and my friends to spend the rapidly approaching May holidays there. The house was usually located in a village on the outskirts of the city, as is usually the case, and was a small building of about 20 square meters and 2 floors, if you count the attic. And there was also a small addition with a stone stove with cooking surfaces in it. My parents usually cooked food on them when we came here for gardening activities, which I hated with all my heart and soul, but I was too young then and nobody asked my opinion. I used to change into old clothes with a shovel at the ready, helped my parents plant potatoes, which, by the way, was much cheaper to buy in the market than to do everything we did back then. Well, actually, after a long day of work, when it was already dark, we went into the house, washed a little in turn in a basin with boiling water diluted with cold water, and sat down to do our own business while waiting for dinner. By the way, at that time we had electricity and water supplied from the city there. It wasn't cold, and even in such a small house, there were all the conditions for a comfortable living. Soon the room began to fill with incredibly delicious smells of fried meat, onions, and potatoes that I hated so much. I really liked that atmosphere. It was in the evening at our country site that I felt very cozy and comfortable, and I wanted to stay awake as long as possible. Usually, there was much less work on the next day, but it didn't prevent me from hating it as much as the first one. We worked less because the working week was approaching, and my mom and dad wanted to relax as much as I did, looking forward to wearing the backpack on my back and going to the 3-story school building. Usually, in the first half of the day, all the work on the garden was completed, and in the second half, everyone rested. My mother once again pleased us with culinary masterpieces prepared on the stove, and my father constantly ran from the woodpile to the improvised kitchen, stuffing firewood into the furnace. Well, I was sitting outside and trying to build a fire to make a contribution to the preparation of dinner by frying bread and a few sausages on it. Soon that evening, I've seen absolutely different guys of the serene, cozy atmosphere of the countryside. That weekend we also stayed the night, and after dinner and washing in the same basin, we went to bed. My mom and dad were sleeping on the couch, and since there was no other place to sleep, I got a folding bed. I couldn't fall asleep for a long time that night. This was due to the periodic snoring of my father, and the sudden raging wind on the street, gusts of which whistled past our house. The situation scared me a little, or rather, it didn't scare me, but it strained me. That's why I couldn't sleep. The pitch darkness that had crept into our house began to affect my mind. There was no light on the street, although streetlights stood over the road next to our house. They didn't work at night. In the evening, they were turned on for just a couple of hours, and then the light faded and was turned on again only the next evening. The branches of the trees swaying in the wind in the dark looked like the huge hands of some terrible creature, constantly trying to attack our small shelter. Well, I was only 10 years old at the time, and my imagination was at its best, especially when I saw such things outside the window. I was peering into the darkness then, not hiding, not trying to cover my head with a blanket. It seemed to take over my mind, not letting me do the things I had just mentioned. And in one moment, not far from the main road over which the streetlights should work, and on which people usually come to the village, I saw some kind of movement. It was the thought that I must have imagined it, and the desire to make sure of it that made me, a little stupid boy, peer into the darkness even better and see someone walking in the distance. The fences of the country houses were located directly above the road, and the one who was wandering there was behind that fence, but I managed to spot him, especially after a few seconds, when the person who was walking there got to the house made of white brick, which was the only one that stood out from this dense darkness. The silhouette I saw was walking near the house. He walked extremely strangely. He swayed in different directions, raising his hands a little. No. He wasn't staggering around like some alcoholic. His legs were still on the ground, and the upper half of his body was swaying in different directions. It looked extremely strange, and I would even say that goosebumps instantly ran all over my body. I didn't stop watching him exactly until I saw him stop. Apparently, he was facing me. Or maybe he wasn't, because I could see only a dark silhouette in such oppressive darkness. He stood there for a moment, and then he was gone, just merged into the darkness. The last thing I managed to see as he quickly ran away from that house made of white brick, thereby hiding. But a complete surprise for me was that, not even 10 seconds later, he appeared in our yard right next to the house, and just as quickly, he leaned against the window on the opposite side. My little heart almost stopped in that second. Right in front of the window appeared the one who a few seconds ago was walking 100 meters from our house. I couldn't see him properly, and in an instant, without feeling my legs from fear, I fell to the floor and screamed like a girl. Of course, my parents jumped out of bed and tried in every possible way to find out what happened and to calm me down. But I was shocked. The fraction of a second in which I saw his image was imprinted in my head as the most terrible thing that I had ever experienced in such a short life at that time. Still, the same dark silhouette was clinging to the window, as if realizing that I had been looking at him all this time. My parents tried to calm me down somehow, and I stared at the window with my eyes like nickels. I didn't hear them. Their voices seemed to be muffled for me, and only when the light bulb in the room flared up, I came to my senses, and I began to tell my parents what had happened to me, pointing my finger in the direction of the window. I tried to prove to them that there was a swaying man walking in the street now. My mother somehow tried to cheer me up, and my father laughed with me, explaining that the swaying man is my grandfather when he spends half a day with a neighbor in the garage. But it scared me so much that for a long time, I remembered the very split second in which he suddenly appeared in front of me, and I could only guess when I went to bed at night who he was, because I already knew that it was just impossible to overcome such a distance in a couple of seconds. Years passed, I grew up, and that situation from childhood was gradually pushed out of my memory by fresh good and not so good events and memories. Studying, friends, part-time jobs, parties, quarrels with parents, or in other words, a typical life of a teenager. My parents and I went to the village less and less often, and for so many years, a once cozy house with a nice warm room turned into a warehouse of garden equipment. No one stayed there for the night. Electricity disappeared from the village due to the fact that a pole crashed nearby, breaking all the wires, but no one was in a hurry to go there and repair anything. There was no water either. The constant burglaries of the neighboring cottages forced my parents to fork out and put bars on the windows. Frankly speaking, I also had a lot of other worries, and I began to go there less and less often, and then only if my mother asked me to help with something, dig up there, clean up a little on the site, and so on. This is a short story of our country house, but it wouldn't be complete without the part I will tell you now. It happened 2 weeks ago. As I said at the very beginning of this story, the May holidays came and, of course, my few friends and I began to think about how we would get together and fry a barbecue. But we didn't think for a long time because my best friend since childhood, Michael, suggested a good idea to gather at my country house. It was warm outside, so it would be good to stay the night. Why not? I thought then. And on the evening of that day, I begged my mother to give me the keys. Of course, she understood how it could end up meaning a mess, garbage, and a drunk me coming home from dawn. It wasn't for the first time, so my mother knew what to expect. In general, my mother doubted a little, just for effect, and in the morning she still gave me the keys. and menacingly waving her finger in front of my satisfied face, told me to behave properly and to be careful. The feast was planned for 4 people. Our company isn't so big, just me, Mike, his girlfriend Emma, and her friend Mia. But we are real friends. As usual, for half a day we wandered through supermarkets and markets in search of normal meat for the barbecue, bought up alcohol and snacks, and after finishing the purchase, we called a taxi and went to the village in which I hadn't been at that time for about a year, and in which for the first time in my life I would be without my parents. We left the taxi, barely carried those packages with the purchased goods. Moreover, Mike somehow tore one of them, and sometime Mike and I were making a fire in the grill and preparing meat, while the girls were setting the table outside, making sandwiches and cutting veggies. Everyone was busy with their own business, and I loved the atmosphere. And by the way, in case of darkness, there were 3 kerosene lamps in the house. In any other way, we usually tried to leave here before the evening, but we didn't always manage to. Finally, at about 4 p.m., we finished all the preparations. The smell of roasted meat seemed to spread through the village, driving our stomachs crazy. Mike proposed a toast, then the second one, and so on. We told jokes, laughed, sang songs, and generally had as much fun as we could. Slowly it began to get dark. At the beginning, the light from the still burning fire was enough, but it didn't last long, because the darkness, which was so familiar to me, covered everything very quickly. I went into the house and tried to light the lamp. The room was filled with light and my soul felt somehow warm. Not only because of the vodka. Just as I was about to leave, Mike and Emma suddenly appeared right in front of me. "You're going to make love, aren't you?" I asked, smiling. My friend just nodded drunkenly and went into the room. I left the house and put the lamp on the table. Well, now I can also make some love, I thought to myself, and struck up a conversation with a friend of Mike's girlfriend, and she actually didn't mind. We had a nice, pleasant conversation about everything. We didn't turn silent for a single moment, except for the moments when we were eating. "Why are they so quiet? Usually they are not," I asked my companion in surprise. She just shrugged. I got up from the table and went into the house. "Why are you peeking?" A drunken, arrogant voice was heard. "I'm just checking to see if you've kicked the bucket." "I'm fine. Everything is alright, bro," he said, hiccuping. "I'll be right out." "Oh, come on. Lie down and rest." I went outside and stretched a little, and then Mia asked me an extremely strange question. "Listen, do you have people wandering on the streets at this time of night here?" "Well, we're celebrating, and we've just recently started." "That's not what I mean." "Then what?" "Well, I kind of saw someone on the road." "I don't know. Maybe someone was getting home?" "At 2:30 in the morning?" she asked in surprise. "Well, yeah." "Strange people." "Come on. Maybe the person also celebrated the holiday." "Probably. It was so noticeable." She smiled, saying that. "He staggered so strangely. He seemed to go straight, but the body was swaying in different directions." I dropped the glass on the ground. In my hand, it was as if everything was rewound, and I went back to that terrible night when I saw him standing opposite the house of the white brick, when he clung to the window. This story, though, was forgotten so many years ago, but after Mia's words, I remembered every second of that night, which actually gave me goosebumps like never before, and the alcoholic intoxication disappeared in an instant. "What's wrong?" she asked me. "Get into the house, now!" I shouted, and taking my friend's arm, threw her into the room just before I entered by myself. The last thing I saw before closing the door with all the available locks was how a swaying man was already standing next to our gate, trying to open it. It was at that moment that I saw his huge height. It was dark outside, but I managed to notice that he was about 10 feet tall. I couldn't understand why he tried to open the gate if he could just step over. It was his huge height that threw bad thoughts into my head, The thought that this is some kind of abnormal shit. It's hard to describe the way he was swaying, but it reminded me of those air dancers, which are usually used for advertising some gas stations and various shops. I quickly locked the door and put out the kerosene lamp at the house, but the lamp was still burning outside, thus showing the fact that someone was here.
"What happened?"
Mia asked me in a frightened voice. I didn't say anything, just put my finger to my lips and looked out of the window. The one who was already standing behind the fence was already on my side, and an unpleasant prickling feeling appeared at my lower abdomen. Fear gradually came over me with its veil, and not just me, but also Mia. Luckily, the two of our company were sleeping. The swaying man was approaching the house, and when he came to the kerosene lamp hanging on the tree, I took a better look at him. I wish I hadn't been looking out of the window. Something incredible, something that shouldn't exist in the world of science and rationalism, was staggering eerily toward the house. An entity that vaguely resembled the silhouette of a man, a very tall man, was approaching the house. But when he approached even closer, I finally realized that he wasn't a human at all, and I walked away from the window in silent shock from what was standing next to the house. The huge creature was made from some sort of trash. Bones, some boards, pieces of broken slate, tree branches could be seen from under his skin. All this fit compactly into his tall body. He still stood and swayed, clinging to the branches of the apricot tree growing near the house. Not even the night when I was little and saw him for the first time. Suddenly the swaying man, as I had called him when I was a child, seemed to go mad, swaying the upper half of his body. He turned the table we were sitting at and started throwing everything that was standing right next to the house. It felt like there was a hurricane outside. I stood in the stupor and refused to understand that it was all real. Suddenly, Mike woke up and began to call me with a half-drunk voice. That was the turning point. The crazy creature outside the window had stopped, and there was an impressive silence in which only soft footsteps could be heard behind the house. I ran to my friend and put my hand over his mouth. My madly frightened look at him was enough to make him close his mouth and not say a word. As soon as I turned around, I saw Mia pointing her finger at the window, fearfully stepping back. After that, I looked out the window myself and immediately backed away. This time, there was no longer the dark silhouette that I had seen as a child, but now a terrible creature with almost half a torn face was looking at us. The skin was more like crumpled paper. Demonic, bottomless eyes examined everything that was inside the house. They saw us, me, Mia, the sleeping Emma, and Mike. Those eyes saw everything. In an instant, our staring turned into something terrible. He smashed the window and grabbed Mia. He gripped her with a huge hand, as if with a vice, which caused my friend's face to freeze in a silent scream. She couldn't even scream because of the incredible pain. And to save her, I grabbed a shovel standing nearby, and with all my strength began to beat the limb of the freak standing by the window. But he was stronger, and after his incredibly terrible moan, our friend's body was torn into two halves. Seeing this, everything that we ate today got to my throat. Blood splattered all over the walls, and two pieces of Mia fell to the ground with a terrible sound. My hands and my face were covered in blood. Seeing the same thing as me, Mike screamed in desperate rage, unable to restrain himself any longer. Emma woke up immediately. I frantically tried to find my phone in my pocket in order to call the police and take a picture of the monster that so terribly dealt with Mia. Mike and Emma were already trying to open the door and run out into the street. They wanted to get away from the creature without realizing that one of its steps is equal to 6 to 7 of their steps. In general, I barely stopped him, and taking out my phone, I took a picture of that creature. The image was of extremely poor quality because it was pitch dark, but he was clearly visible there. I'll attach the picture at the end. I called the police, explaining that a woman was killed there. They arrived quickly and the creature that did all this disappeared as quickly as it appeared. We were saved from the monster, but not from the law. Long trials, interrogations, investigations led to nothing. My friends and I described to the investigator who did all this, but of course, no one believed us, and I wouldn't have believed it either. But we were saved from 10 to 15 years of prison by an incident that occurred 2 days after the events experienced. In another house in our village, they also found a dead, decapitated man. Probably a thief, since he had nothing to do with this house at all. The head was never found. They found only bits of it, and it looked like it had been crushed like a walnut. And one more detail is that this man managed to take a photo of the monster at the last second of his life.